Ever since her release, Clorinde has been slept on, with many people just underestimating her potential or completely overlooking how strong she is, or how much value she carries, especially as a damage dealer. And over the last few patches, Clorinde has just continued to get better, having multiple top tier teams while at the same time not utilizing that many popular characters, practically ensuring you're always going to have a strong second side to your Abyss, while at the same time not really having any strong enemy counters. Hello there, Flip here, and today we're going to be talking about Clorinde, going over her strengths and then giving an in-depth look into her artifacts, weapons, teams, and constellations, so that you can maximize the champion duelist. Channel members, I love you and really do appreciate all of your support, and with that, let's begin. Thankfully, unlike some other characters, Clorinde's kit is actually pretty straightforward. Despite having some of the coolest normal attack animations, these practically won't be doing anything, and the only time you'll really see them is as filler when Clorinde's skill duration isn't up. Speaking of her skill, it makes Clorinde enter the Night Watch state and undergo a stance change, where her normal attacks get converted to gunfire, and if you press the skill button while in the Night Watch state, it'll make Clorinde do a dash attack. Also, while in her skill state, Clorinde will be unable to heal from normal means, as her kit revolves around Bond of Life. You know, that one mechanic that was on 3 characters and then never seen again. To briefly explain what Bond of Life shortens to BOL is, it's a mechanic that appears over your HP bar that has a maximum value of 200%, and it prevents you from healing, kind of acting like a separate health bar, and in Clorinde's case it will dictate what action you do. Her normal attacks will generate 35% Bond of Life when fired, and they also do more damage while you're under 100% Bond of Life, so when that red bar is under half your HP bar, it does more damage, and very conveniently, when your Bond of Life is at 100% or higher, it makes it so that your dash attacks do more damage. So the way you want to play Clorinde is going to be to normal attack 3 times and then dash with your skill to reset your Bond of Life. Additionally, when you do a dash attack above 100% Bond of Life, you get healed, and because Clorinde does around 6 of these dashes per skill state, you are getting enough healing to where Clorinde can get by just fine without defensive options in her teams a lot of the time, which is a nice upside and aids in her flexibility. Now before moving on to the rest of her kit, I just want to give you some tips as a Clorinde main, as utilizing some of these tricks in your gameplay loop can just give you a better time. The first is that Clorinde's hitboxes are kind of wonky, or I guess they're very generous. You can very easily just hit enemies behind you or those who aren't directly in your line of sight, and even without a grouper, Clorinde just has amazing area coverage that makes her an amazing option for AoE content. Another benefit to Clorinde is the fact that her dashes can be used as a repositioning tool. You will be able to dash away from enemies' attacks while not losing any damage in return, being able to dash out of enemy hurt boxes and then dashing back into them, and it both looks cool as fuck while having practical uses. Clorinde's skill up time is only 8 seconds, so being staggered is a death sentence to your damage, and why I would recommend learning to dodge attacks with her dashes, as it can be beneficial for a lot of matchups. Just keep in mind that you don't actually get iframes, so dodge before the attack actually happens. This may mean having to dash earlier than getting your buffed skill, but again, doing a weaker attack is still better than getting staggered on Clorinde. And the last thing is that unlike Yoimiya or any normal attack spam heavy characters, with Clorinde, if you just hold down the normal attack button, she will continue to fire. You never actually have to let go of your normal attack button, and pressing the dash button while holding down the normal attack button will make it so that you will immediately continue firing the moment the dash is done, which is a lot more intuitive and easier to pilot than spam clicking. You do now have to remember the timing of when to press your skill, but this is still just a much better way to play Clorinde in my opinion, while guaranteeing you won't get carpal tunnel in the future. Now for the rest of Clorinde's kit, she has a very good elemental burst that is able to act as a combo opener or combo ender. It doesn't really matter much which approach you take, just don't use the burst during Clorinde's skill state, as that will make you lose uptime from her skill. The burst also gives Clorinde 100% Bond of Life, which allows her to instantly be able to do a dash attack when she enters this skill state, or just give you more Bond of Life for healing if you already have some left over. Clorinde's burst is important for her damage, but not important enough that you have to sacrifice stats to build ER. But because Fischl and Auroron are such good batteries for Clorinde, it does lead into why when looking at her team building, they tend to just be the best Electro units to pair with her. Now for passive talents, basically Clorinde does more damage the more Electro reactions are triggered, up to 3 times. It can even be the same Electro reaction, this just gives Clorinde extra scaling on top of her attacks. And for her Ascension 4, yap, it just gives her 20 extra crit rate. And when you get healed, it will go towards your Bond of Life, allowing you to get your dash attacks out faster if you have a good healer. But this is too hard to actually gauge, so I just recommend sticking with her regular combos, to be honest. So yes, overall she's a very straightforward damage dealer, with the biggest thing setting her apart being just how good her AoE is, and the second thing being her value, which will be talked about more when we get to discussing her teammates. For now though, let's move on to talk about how to gear her correctly, as there are some things I want to say. Put the Thundering Fury set down, please. There seems to be a common line with people who think Thundering Fury is Clorinde's best set, and those who think Clorinde is a bad unit. But at this stage in the game, if you want to actually feel like your Clorinde does something, then please stop using TF. The idea behind using TF in the first place is to make Clorinde do 2 skills with 1 long rotation, and while that is nice on paper, the fact that her personal damage is lower doesn't really make up for it, as you aren't able to reach certain damage breakpoints as fast, which leads you to taking longer to kill a boss where Whimsy or Gladiators that could have done it quicker. And not only that, but Clorinde's biggest strength is the fact that she has so many team options, and Thundering Fury only really works well in her Dendro teams, as in other teams she doesn't trigger reactions that often, so when you're using TF you're doing less damage to play longer rotations, while also just trapping yourself into Dendro teams. It just isn't worth the trade-off, and you should be working towards farming Whimsy as it's her best DPS set. If you are low ping and happen to have an Echo set, then you can also go for that, or just using good old Gladiators, as you can passively get good pieces from that. For main stats, you want to use an attack Sans that contributes to her passive. It is even still her best main set on aggravate teams. The only case where an EM Sans is better on Clorinde is going to be Quick Bloom teams, where she's also triggering Hyper Blooms. And then for Goblets, obviously using an Electro one as well as a crit rate circlet. Now let's move on to her weapons, in which here is her weapon sheet for aggravate teams first. Absolution is of course going to be her best general weapon by a decent margin, and then from there pretty much any crit 5-star should be good. Just keep in mind that with crit rate weapons like Haran and Jade Cutter, Clorinde innately gets like 40 crit rate for free from just ascending her as well as her Ascension 4, so if you do plan to use these weapons you want to be very wary of crit rate substats. Now I'm going to continue to yap about the weapon options, but let's switch over to the non-aggravate weapon rankings. For 4-star weapons, Calamity of Eshu if you have a shielder is going to be your best bet. It was the free event sword. Clorinde does commonly run shielder, so this is a very good weapon for her. But generally your best 4-star option is going to be the Finale of the Deep. It's a craftable that you should be able to R5, in which especially on aggravate teams can even be similar to some 5-star weapons. Also I should mention that if you're using Nahida for the EM buff, then the Foliar sword should be closer to the other 5-star weapons, as the weapon benefits a lot from EM. With the Uraku sword, you really want to be using Shilonen on the team or any other Geo character, and if you are using Mistsplitter, make sure to start all your rotations with her burst so you can get all 3 stacks. And there aren't any other standout weapon options really, so let's go ahead to talk about her biggest strength, her teammate diversity. Clorinde is all in for DEI. Clorinde has multiple different team archetypes, as I've said, and the only really important thing to note universally is that you most likely will have to pair her with a second Electro for her passive, or just to set up characters like Shilonen or Kazuha. Fischl is Clorinde's best teammate universally for this reason, working with all of Clorinde's teams, providing strong sub DPS damage and being a battery for her to gain her burst. If you want to use Clorinde long term, I'd really recommend investing a decent chunk of resources into Fischl as well. Auroron at C6 can also be good, if not an upgrade to Fischl and ECN Overload teams, especially being a much better fit for the Elegy of the End bow. So if you ever manage to snag some Auroron coins and want to free Fischl for another half, then you can use him as well. The last Electro unit you can use for Clorinde is going to be Sara, but only if she's C6, as otherwise she doesn't do enough to justify a place. Sara just amplifies Clorinde the most with her buffs, but the only trade-off is that she's very clunky to play, and also Fischl and Auroron tend to just be better regardless. Another downside to Sara is the fact that her energy economy is terrible, so expect to have to burst every other rotation with Clorinde, which cannot feel that great. I'd only consider Sara if you have a decent amount of vertical investment on your Clorinde, or you're trying to do some speedrun clears. Now going from best to worst, the strongest team archetype currently for Clorinde is just Chevreuse Overload, which has now been completed with the release of Malvika. You of course have to use Chevreuse, and then you want another Pyro unit, which can be Bennett, Malvika, Toma, or Pyro MC, or Xiangling. Bennett is the best for front loading damage, but the Overload buff will fall off towards the latter part of your rotation, so he's going to be a nice choice for like speedrunning stuff, but for practical uses I'd go to the other options. Malvika is the best generally, applying consistent Pyro, giving a damage bonus to Clorinde, and either being able to hold the scroll set, or if you're using Auroron she can hold Codex, and do great sub DPS damage. Toma is extremely comfy to play due to the fact that he shields and has one of the stronger ones, and he enables the Calamity Sword, which is a great offensive benefit. Pyro Traveler just hold scroll. Personally, I wouldn't really use him over Toma, as he isn't that much of a damage upgrade over him while losing the shield, so And lastly, you can also use Xiangling. Normally she would force you on 20-second long rotations, however you want to use Xiangling's burst every other rotation on this team to keep Clorinde doing 17-second long rotations, which is just better than trying to get her to burst every rotation. One more thing to note is that Xiangling, Pyro MC, and Toma all optimally want to use full EM builds for their damage, as with both Clorinde and Fischl's Electro application it will be the dominant element, and you will be able to get strong overloaded damage while running full EM builds. And then the last slot of your team will be one of the 3 Electro units who I've already covered the positives of. The second strongest Clorinde team in my opinion is going to be Aggravate, which consists of Fischl or Sara. Please just use Fischl. Shilonen, Sucrose, or Kazuha as your buffer, and then your Dendro unit of choice, in which the only 3 standout ones are Nahida, Kirara, and Baizu. Aggravate teams bank on applying Electro very frequently so you can get more aggravated hits, as well as proccing Fischl's A4 very often, which Clorinde applying Electro around 14 times with their skill alone can obviously benefit from triggering aggravates. Between Nahida Nahida, Baizu, and Kirara, I honestly think at this stage Kirara is your best bet, especially if you have constellations on her like her C4 for extra Dendra application or her C6 for just a small damage bonus. Clorinde isn't able to freely swap out like other aggravate triggers, so killing enemies and then having no Dendra application is a massive drawback, which is something Kirara doesn't have to face as her Dendra application can apply between waves. And because Quicken lasts 11 seconds at a base without the need to reapply Dendra, then it doesn't actually matter that Kirara has slower Dendra application. And she also gets to run a weapon like Sapwood Blade for buffing and enable the Calamity Sword, which again is a pretty big benefit. Nahida still is amazing though, giving 250 EM to Clorinde, who normally doesn't build that much EM, but I just don't think losing the interruption resistance is really worth it when the damage is so close anyways. Next up we have Electrocharge teams, which just replace your Dendra unit for Furina or Yelan. Nothing that interesting happens in this team, just the fact that Yelan and Furina are very good units. Also, Auroron slots in very nicely here as well if you want to gain use from him. Sucrose after the transformative damage increase also works great as a buffer, giving a team-wide EM buff to increase Electrocharge damage. The next Clorinde team I want to talk about is my personal favorite of mine, that it's very underrated being quick burn teams. This team does need Emily to feel good, but basically the idea behind the team is that the Quicken Aura acts as a Dendra one for other reactions besides Aggravate, so it's possible to trigger burning on a Quicken Aura. Emily doesn't actually need that much burning application for things like her level 2 lamp and A4, and therefore you'll be able to burn enough to trigger Emily's abilities while still having solid Quicken uptime. And I know the team sounds stupid, but it's one of the best Clorinde teams I've used and is extremely fucking funny just how viable it is. Clorinde, Emily, and Fischl are all musts for this team. Fischl's the only Electro with enough application to main Quicken alongside Clorinde. You need Emily as she's the only reason you're adding in burning in the first place, and you're going to choose between Toma, Xiangling, and Malvuika as your power units of choice. If you are using Xiangling or Toma, then you want them to hold D-put to buff Emily's damage, and of course Malvuika still utilizes Scroll to pass buffs onto both your Electro and Dendra characters. Now, keeping with the theme of underrated Clorinde teams, you can now talk about Double Geo Clorinde, which pretty much was just breathed into existence by Xilonen, and allows Clorindes to utilize even more teammates. You want to use your Electro partner of choice, Xilonen, and now you have a few Geo units to choose from. Yunjin is a character that a lot of people wanted to work with Clorinde, but this was never really realized due to the fact that she was just awkward to slot into Clorinde's teams due to her energy requirements. But now with Xilonen there to act as a Geo battery, this can be a lot more realized. Besides Yunjin, Shiori can be added for her sub DPS damage, strongly for Petra and shielding, and that's pretty much it. It is weaker in power compared to other Clorinde teams like the ones I've mentioned prior, as you just don't get strong buffs or reactions to add extra damage, but it still covers more team options for Clorinde, which is nice. The last Clorinde team I want to spotlight is Quick Bloom teams, which just haven't aged the best at all. There are different ways to run the team, but it's usually a Hydra unit, Fischl, and then Nahida. This team is like Quick Burn, but instead of getting some burning alongside Quicken, you're generating and triggering Hyper Blooms alongside Quicken. It's fine for bosses, but due to the lack of buffs, it doesn't really end up being better than Clorinde's top 3 teams in single target, while losing in AoE too obviously. And Clorinde inherently has no reason to build EM, so it's just a mess of a team I wouldn't really recommend, but strong enough to warrant to mention, I guess. I should also mention now that Lanyan is a very good Onoma replacement or Xilonen replacement if you want to use her. She's a very good shielder and can hold Hakushin Ring or Thrilling Tales. Now back on topic, something you should have noticed within all these Clorinde teams is despite being an attack scaler, she doesn't really utilize Bennett at all. Her teams are in fact better without him, and unlike other damage dealers, she isn't really tied to using top tier supports like Xilonen, Kazuha, or Furina. The only thing her top 3 archetypes, Aggravate, Chevries, and Electrocharge share is the fact that you want a second Electro unit, but as long as you have that, you're easily able to expand and use a variety of teams, while utilizing characters that aren't that highly sought after like Yunjin, Toma, or Kirara. This is why I think Clorinde is one of the most valuable damage dealers, because especially for an attack scaler, not needing Bennett is such a massive upside, while having so many different team archetypes. And her comfort is insane with her continuous self-healing and the fact that some of her best teammates are shielders anyways, so you don't really have to sacrifice a lot to use them unlike other damage dealers. So if you wanted a reason to pick up Clorinde, here's one of them. No more yapping needed about her teams, let's talk about her constellations now. Clorinde being a modern carry of course has some pretty insane constellations. Right off the bat, her C1 gives you 10 additional Electro hits, being a 20% damage increase while increasing Clorinde's Electro application by adding in 5 more hits that apply Electro. Although since Clorinde is normally paired with Fischl, the extra Electro application doesn't really do anything except aid in maintaining Quicken, which can be a benefit on Quick Bloom or Quick Burn teams. Clorinde C2 is one of her best constellations, as not only is it a massive damage increase by supercharging her A1 talent, but at the same time, when you're able to fully stack the passive, which is extremely easy, it gives Clorinde some interruption resistance, making her shieldless teams a lot more playable. The best thing about this passive is that it doesn't change the amount of attack Clorinde needs to reach the cap on her passive, so you don't need to adjust your builds at all. C3 increases Clorinde's skill talent, just a minor 7% damage increase. C4 just puts Clorinde's burst on steroids based on your bond of life, and you'll need 100% bond of life for it to deal its maximum damage. But the thing is, it's essentially a free 200% damage bonus boost due to the fact that Clorinde's burst always gives her bond of life before dealing damage, so unlike something like Wanderer C2, it doesn't change at all how you want to rotate with Clorinde. And being an 18% damage increase. C5 makes the burst do even more damage for a 5% damage increase over C4, and now we're at Clorinde C6. As with all C6s, Clorinde is pretty ludicrous and it's good for her both defensively and offensively. Her playstyle does slightly change, as when you use her skill, Clorinde gains 10 crit rate and 70 crit damage, so you're always going to want to use Clorinde's burst after her skill optimally, so it benefits from the extra crit. And on top of this, Clorinde gains 6 shade attacks that do a fuck ton of damage and are triggered when Clorinde gets hit or does a dash attack. You do only have 6 shades, and while they're active, Clorinde also just becomes the fucking wall, mitigating damage by 80%, and having resistance to interruption even further increased. It's a massive 90% damage increase overall while having great defensive properties. Overall, Clorinde's constellations are great, and as standard, C2 is a good stopping point. And that will conclude the guide portion of the video. All in all, I still don't get the hate for Clorinde. She has a variety of top meta teams while at the same time not having an abyss that she's really struggled against. As well as being an amazing option for this abyss, dismantling the second half, as she's one of the best checks for the papilla type enemies in the game. Clorinde has amazing AoE, solid single target especially when paired with Fischl or Yelan, no Bennett dependence in any of her team archetypes, and just overall one of the most versatile DPS. The only real flaw to her is that without things like her signature weapon or some of her cons, her personal damage isn't as high as the other Pyro or Hydra DPS in the meta, but I don't see that as a massive flaw when her teammates are some of the best off-field DPS regardless. Clorinde is definitely a top tier DPS and I'm tired of pretending she's not. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe and comment your thoughts on Clorinde, as I'd love to hear it and respond to almost every single comment. Channel members, I love you and appreciate all your support, it really does mean the world to me. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.